Everybody. I hope everybody on Zoom can hear me, and if you can't, then just send a message to the chat box and we'll get that figured out. But I want to thank everybody for coming this morning. This is our first in-person 59-minute meeting since probably about March of 2020. We went to online for Zoom exclusively, but now we have a hybrid format. So we have people here in the big classroom at BRR, and we have people on Zoom. Today we'll be hearing from Tim Keane, who is the City of Boise's Planning and Development Services Director. He's going to be talking about the new zoning code rewrite that's going to be coming into implementation in December and what realtors need to know. This 59-minute meeting is also recorded, so if anybody needs it afterwards, we can send that out. Tim's also got some materials that you guys can pick up on the way out, and that'll be at the conclusion. So he's going to go through his presentation, and then we'll take some questions at the end. We should have about 20 or so minutes for questions. I think there will be a lot. So we'll take questions from in the room, but then also on Zoom. But without further ado, let's welcome Tim Keane.
Thank you, Cameron. How do I operate the slides?
Oh, you got to click it right here. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming. As Cameron said, I'm Tim Keane, Director of Planning for the City of Boise, and with me is Andrea Tuning, who's worked on this zoning rewrite for 3 or 4 years and will be instrumental in implementing it as well. So I'm going to go through some slides here to facilitate an explanation of the new zoning ordinance, and towards the end we'll get into kind of implementation, which starts on December 1st. There you go. Just a little bit about the process. This year, in February, we released a draft or final version of the ordinance that ended up going to public hearings, starting with the Planning and Zoning Commission in April. We had a week-long series of public hearings. We had an incredible amount of turnout. If you participated in those, you can speak to the incredible number of Boise residents that came out to speak at the Planning and Zoning Commission on all sides of this issue, those that were in support, those that were against, those that just had suggestions for changes that should be made. That happened in April. The Planning and Zoning Commission ultimately recommended approval of the new zoning ordinance unanimously in April. Then we went to the City Council and had a similar week of public hearings. Again, a tremendous number of people over 4 or 5 days speaking to City Council on this issue. Council ultimately voted unanimously as well to approve the new ordinance. So that was in June, which put us in motion to implementation. When Council adopted the ordinance in June, they set a December 1st date for the new ordinance being active. So we're now working on preparing for that, which is quite an endeavor. As you can imagine, we've got the existing ordinance that people are currently working within, and we're going to shift. It'll take a little bit of time to shift over to the new ordinance starting on December 1st, and I'll get into that a little bit later.
Sorry, I'm trying to run it from back here too. Hold on. Taylor, is it enter or next?
The arrow. The arrow. The one that goes forward.
It's not working.
Up to the ordinance.
Oh, good.
I'm going to speak a little bit to the process that led to this new ordinance and the kinds of issues we were dealing with. This, of course, was a long public process over several years. I've been involved in it since March of 2022, and even in my time here, we had a tremendous number of public meetings and long discussions with residents about these issues. Number one, addressing the big issues we have in the city, especially housing affordability and mobility, transportation-related things, and being more conscious about water and energy consumption, the environment, adapting to a changing climate, and supporting, a growing city. to put in place. The thing about this is that the existing zoning ordinance in Boise was adopted in 1966. So we've been living with these set of regulations for that long. 1966 was a time when cities across this country were adopting new rules for development that put in place the parameters around what we've now seen for a generation of development. And so what we have around us is much to do with those ordinances that were adopted in the 60s and 70s. And so it's not often we do this. The point is to create an ordinance that addresses the way we think the city should grow now, based on the circumstances we have now and the constraints that we have now, but towards a way of growing such that the city gets stronger and better and we address these big issues.
Could you just speak a little bit closer to the mic? Yeah. I'm having some trouble hearing you.
Why don't we all move forward?
Okay, I can speak up.
The Zoom folks that are trying to hear you.
We can go to the next slide if you're operating the slide. So in terms of the big ways in which this ordinance is structured, the first thing is that we try to put density where it's helpful. Every city, every town has density, no question. Every place in this region has density. It's a question of where is it. We want it to be in places where the density can be helpful. So those places for us are downtown, along a few corridors, State Street, Fairview, and Vista in particular, along our pathway corridors. Again, and then in these activity centers. And again, the point of this is where density is helpful. Where density is helpful is where people can be living and have access to other ways to get around other than driving. You know, if you spread density across the landscape, that's not as helpful because now everyone's driving to do everything. They have no choice. What we want is choice, and to have choice, we have to be particular about where the density goes. And so these places, these corridors, downtown, activity centers, are places where we can have mixed use, where people can walk to some things, where we've got our best transit service, where we're going to be investing in transit more. Imagine State Street, the BRT investment that's happening there. So the first thing was to put our density where the most density, where it's most helpful, where people can have options for how they get around the city. Next slide. I think there's one before this. I think we skipped one. Downtown. So downtown right now is on something called C5. In the new ordinance, it's called MX5, and the area that's covered by this downtown zoning grows a little bit in this new ordinance. So it also includes the shoreline area of the city, which right now has the old suburban zoning, commercial and office. So the shoreline part of the city becomes the MX5, and then the Lusk district, which is across from BSU, of course, on 9th and Capitol, that also gets put into the MX5. So C5 becomes MX5, and then the footprint of it grows. Next slide. Then we have something called MX4, which currently would only apply in these locations on State Street. These are places where there's been a lot of planning by the city and the region for the investment we're making in bus rapid transit, better transit service on State Street. So in the planning for that, and there's been, you know, the region and the city have been successful raising money from the federal government to invest in this bus rapid transit. In that planning, there was these 4 station locations identified as the best spots to have the primary stations for the bus rapid transit. So in those locations, again, we want density. Density is helpful. We need it. So we created MX4, which is a transit-oriented district that gives you more height and density permitted. It's mixed use. It doesn't have, you know, suburban style kind of surface park uses. So in those MX4 locations on State Street, those are the only locations in the new ordinance that we're identifying as MX4. It's certainly possible that that would grow in the future if we're able to make other investments in transit. MX4 becomes the best thing for a place on Fairview, for instance, then we can we can add MX4 to other places, but initially it would be at these 4 locations on State Street. Next slide. The MX3 is a district that would apply to those corridors, Fairview State. So on State, it would be between those main station locations. And then it would also be on Fairview and on Vista. It would also be applied to activity centers. Activity centers were identified in the city's comprehensive plan. They're places where you've got a lot of commercial development now, so the mall area and the area around Overland where the theaters are, for instance, places like that. There's smaller ones too, where you've got just commercial development, but there was identified in the comprehensive plan the opportunity for more mixed-use development. So that's activity centers. These places would be MX3, so these are locations that, and you can see on this map, you know, I've identified those locations. It's certainly not the whole city, it's not all the commercial property in the city, it's the places that we think are most suited to this kind of mixed-use redevelopment, more pedestrian-oriented design, and in the MX3 district, you get the height permitted set up to 70 feet. Most of the commercial development in those activity center areas, for instance, or along those corridors where you've got the C zoning currently, it typically is at 45 feet in height. So we're going from 45 feet in those places to 70 feet. And I'll come back to the type of form that we're seeking there when I get into the approval processes. Next slide.
Tim, what did all the little red things represent?
The little red things are actually parcels. Those are parcels. So the blue lines and things, and like you can see it very clearly here, like in the comprehensive plan, that blue circle is the activity center identified. But then within that just kind of generalized circle, the red are the parcels that are affected.
Thank you.
Yes.
Now, on State Street, are you going from downtown all the way out to Gary Lane, or what are you saying on State Street?
The MX3 picks up on State Street. There's some MX3, so on State Street, the question is about State Street and the zoning on State Street. So when you're in downtown, the zoning on the south side of State Street, between, I'm going to say, the Capitol and something like 15th, 16th, is MX5, the downtown district. But on the north side of the street, in those locations, it's MX3. And then it proceeds, there's a section of State Street, as you know, that gets lower density in the houses and things. So there's some other zoning in there that's like R3, I believe. And then the main MX3 on State Street picks up around Whitewater. Whitewater itself is actually, that intersection is actually identified as MX4, which is one of those 4 station locations.
It's just that little.
Just a little area around the intersection at Whitewater is identified as MX4. But then as you're going out on State Street, it would all be MX3 except for those 3 other locations that are MX4. So yeah, so there's State Street. This is, you can see on State Street, MX3, that's the north side of State Street downtown that I mentioned. That would be the MX3. And then you can see it's kind of hit and miss in here for a while, but then it picks up. The reason some of this is not in the red for MX3 there is because of the existing zoning, which is not commercial. It's like R2 and things like this. So yeah, probably the cleanest one is Fairview, which you can see pretty much all being red continuously in MX3. Okay, next slide. One other thing about that is that along those corridors, those MX3 corridors, we, in addition to rezoning the property that's right on the, or converting the zoning from the commercial it is now to MX3, the other thing that we're doing is the property right behind those sites, so this again, State, Fairview, Vista. the properties right behind those MX3 parcels are converting to R2. And the reason for that is there's quite a bit of R1 in those areas now. And we wanted to create a transition from the taller 70 feet mixed MX3 down to the R1. So it's not very deep, but the properties right behind the MX3 become R2, which gives you more of a townhouse type density. And so the distance is only, is it an eighth of a mile or a quarter of a mile, Andrea? An eighth of a mile from State Street, for instance, back into the neighborhood, it becomes the R2. So this map over here is showing where that applies. And this was a big issue with City Council and the neighborhood, the R2 part of it. Doesn't affect that huge amount of the city, but it's an important addition, we think, to the ordinance to ensure that we getting the denser stuff on part of, this issue of density where it's helpful and people having options is for the transit to be successful, you need as many people living near it within walking distance as you can. So it's been proven 100% of the time, if people have to drive to transit, it's not going to work very well. You got to have people living near it. So the R2, adjacent to the MX3, we thought was helpful. And there was some debate about whether we should go further, into the neighborhood with the R2, but we stuck with that kind of right behind the MX3, becoming R2. So those are the basic MX zones. There's one other I didn't mention, which is the MX1, and that's a neighborhood scale. This is the famous Hyde Park example of having mixed use within a neighborhood. And so there's MX1 around as well. It's not as tall, of course, but it gives you a mixed use option more in a neighborhood setting. We also, there's a lot of discussion, of course, in this process about how we ensure that we have a greater diversity of housing in the city. So this, in more of a neighborhood setting within the R1 now, the R1 districts, how can we allow some diversity of housing? So early in the process, the one kind of size fits all approach was to just say on any R1 lot, you can do up to 4 units, 4 units, or today you can do 2. But then we shifted it to say, okay, within those R1 districts, you can do up to 4, but if you do more than 2, then you have to meet some requirements that we're trying to achieve with new development. So as it turned out with City Council, to get more than 2 lots, 2 units on an R1 lot, the additional units have to either meet some affordability thresholds or use sustainable practices in the construction, so water and energy, conscious kinds of measures within the structure itself. So that would give you up to 4, 3 or 4 units on an R1 lot, provided you do 1 or 2 of these things. Now, with regard to all these incentives, let me say we're right now preparing something called a user's guide for these incentives, so that we'll be able to hand to anybody that comes in that wants to take advantage of these. That kind of takes you a step-by-step process through how this would work, because we really want these to be successful. The first one is the up to 4 units on one R1 lot. The second is something called strategic infill. We called it that. It's not called that in the ordinance, but the idea here was to even allow some more density in particular locations in the R1 districts. And this came out of the public process as well, because originally people were worried that if we just allow more density in the neighborhood throughout the neighborhood, then it could be on any street anywhere. There's no kind of threshold for where you could do this. And there was a lot of concern about the demolition of existing structures, that this would precipitate the demolition of existing structures. So we came up with strategic infill to say that if you're on or within 300 feet of a collector street in the city, collector streets are a little bit busier streets in the city. They're not super busy. There's lots of collector streets in Boise. They're throughout the city. In the north end, for instance, 4th Street would be a collector, or 13th Street would be a collector. I think maybe 9th Street even is a collector. So and every part of the city has them. They're not limited to one area. Every part of the city has a collector. So if you're on a collector or within 300 feet of a collector, which is one block, then you can do strategic infill. Also, it has to be a vacant lot, or you have to reuse the existing structure on the property in pursuit of this. So with those conditions, you can do up to 4 units on the lot, period. You can do 5 to 8 units on the lot if one of the units meets the affordability requirements. So for a rental, it would be income restricted to 80% of area median income. If it's a for sale product, then it would be restricted to 120% of area median income. So you can get up to 8 units, 5 to 8, if one of the units is affordable at that level. You can actually get 9 to 12 units if 2 of the units are. So there's several things about this. One, again, thinking about how do we get a little denser as a city, greater diversity of building types. There's lots of properties in the city that have 4 to 12 units on them. They're small apartment buildings, they're few duplexes, they're cottage court, all those kinds of things. Allow those again in all the neighborhoods. But as you get a little bit denser on them, also have the affordability requirements, so we're getting affordable units throughout the city, not just in one place. We don't want them in one place, we don't want them on one parcel, we'd rather them be distributed around the city. So strategic infill is the next one. The third one is adaptive reuse. So in this scenario, you can take an existing single-family home and convert it to multiple units, provided that structure, you don't add on to the structure by more than 10% of the square footage of the structure. So you have an existing house, you convert it into multiple units, you can do that, but you can't add on to the house, more than 10% of its square footage. So these incentives were created to find ways to, not just one way, have multiple ways to try to see how we could achieve more diverse housing, more affordable housing in the city, and have it be throughout the city, not just in one place. And so we want these incentives to be successful, which is why I say we're preparing this user's guide so that it's a simple process to follow, and it's, because the zoning ordinance is a big legal document. It has to be. And so it can be hard to, we'll get used to it. Nobody, we weren't experts in sprawl in 1966. We became experts in sprawl. We have to become experts in something else now. So it'll take a little while. But we think the user's guide will be helpful for these incentives because we really want them to be successful. And we do expect that we'll learn a lot quickly from these. And we do expect to go back to City Council with any kind of adjustments that we need to make to this once we've lived with it for a little while. But having talked to a lot of people about these, we think this is a good place to start. Next slide.
Tim?
Yeah.
Is there going to be a way where we could send our clients or even ourselves online, say, okay, I have a house right here and it's R1C and it's off of State Street or off of Vista? What do I now qualify to do? There seems like there's a lot of overlays. I'm not sure how we figure it out to advise our
Well,
clients.
it's not as complicated as I'm making it sound. In some ways, there is a base zoning that everybody will have, period, and that will be set. And then there'll be these incentives. So the part that will be the trickier part is the incentives, which is why we're doing the user's guide, because it's not technically an overlay, but it's just these other rights that you have in those circumstances. So we are with you. We need to have something that is very clear about what are my options in these cases, because in these incentive cases, we're talking about R1 now. Those are all R1. So the first collection of NX zones that I presented to you are all in the commercial districts, right? So this incentives are related to the R1 districts. So these are neighborhoods. One other thing we didn't include in here, but is important, we think, is we also added to this ordinance that you can actually do a small neighborhood market cafe. Think Roosevelt Market, of course, there used to be others in the city, but this is in an R1 zone as well, and you're permitted to do that by right if the building is on a corner, provided the shop is not bigger than 2,000 square feet. The hours of operation have to be from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. max. Is that where we ended up, Andrea? 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. Do you remember? Look
I
it
can
up.
look that
I think it's 7 a.m. There was something thought it should go later, it should go earlier, but I think it's 7 to 8 p.m. And then there's parking limitations. You can't have much parking. And those kinds of things, but I didn't include that, but I bring it up because that's an R1 option as well that relates to like a cafe or market or shop in a neighborhood, yes.
You were talking about the Roosevelt Market, which I'm very familiar with. So there, the parking is limited to what's on the street and what's available, so does that restrict them how big they can get or how?
Well, the restriction is no bigger than 2,000 square feet. So that's the restriction, it's in the ordinance. The parking limitation is, Andrea could look this up too, but you can't have more than one parking too.
A minimum of one, you can provide more, and it is 7 a.m. to 8 p.m.
Okay, so the hours are 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. You have to have one parking space. You can have more, but you have to have at least one. So this is like Roosevelt Market, which doesn't have off-street parking. It's the same kind of situation. So, yeah. Next slide. So we're in the process of moving to this new ordinance on December 1st. So all of the parcels in the city are the zoning of them is being converted from what they are today to what they will be in the new zoning ordinance. So there's a new map. So if you go on the city website, it's really pretty easy to navigate. In the sense, you can go on the website, look at the map, put in the street address, and then it will bring up for you on the street address what the existing zoning is and what the future zoning would be. So for instance, on State Street, you might have a property that's currently C1, and then in the new zoning, it will be MX3. So you can go there and see what is it now, what will it be under the new zoning ordinance, because when the new ordinance is in effect, you'll have this new collection of mixed-use districts. The R1 will still be R1, but you'll have these other options related to the R1. Next slide. So now I'm going to get into the process a little bit. And if you all have been involved in zoning entitlements and permitting and things like this, and there's some degree of complexity associated with this. That is always the case. Some places it's mind-numbingly complex, and then other places it's okay complex, but it tends to be kind of what it is, because in our case, we're dealing with 86 square miles, thousands of properties, there's some complexity. What we tried to do with this was to simplify it as much as we could, and so, don't judge me right away on this. Sit with it for a few days and then see if you think it's less complex. But a basic thing is what type of, if you're coming in to build, first question will be what type of development are you? You're one of these 4 types. And so, okay, and so types 1 and 2, importantly, don't require a public hearing. That is a big distinction for 1 and 2. 3 and 4 do require some kind of public hearing. So with 3 and 4, it could be that you're going to the Design Review Commission, for instance, which is a public hearing, to have a hearing over the design of a building. In this case, it will be if you're 50 or more units of residential, or I think it's 5,000 square feet of commercial, you have to have a Design Review Commission approval. That's not new. I mean, you have to do that now. But I'm just saying with a type 3, it could be a Design Review Commission review that you have, or it could be a Planning and Zoning Commission review that you have. But with types 3 and 4, you will have a public hearing associated with it. And really the goal here very much, and we were talking about this a year ago or more in our public meetings about the zoning ordinances, a big part of this new zoning ordinance, first one since 1966, is that we want it to be successful. You know, it embodies what we've been saying we care about as a city. So we want to put in place a process that can make that successful. This is a notorious issue for cities where they've created zoning ordinances to achieve what they say they want in their comprehensive plans, but then the process is so onerous, it's really hard to do. We didn't want to step into that here in Boise. So the 4 types are about that. And type 2, for instance, includes some things that we allow these R1 districts, for instance, up to 4 units, or the strategic infill, the incentives, those kinds of things. Even the market and cafe, you know, if you're doing it on a corner, so it's allowed by right, then you're a type 2, so there's no public hearing. So I think I've got a list here. If you go to the next one. And this, I've got 2 takeaways for you here, and one is this slide. One is this slide that goes through what are the different types, so you can see. So you can pick up a sheet of paper when you're leaving that has this same slide on it. We've got hard copies for you, but it identifies what are you of these 4 types. So one thing I'm going to mention here is that type 2 has a lot of important things in it. You know, accessory dwelling unit, duplex, triplex, fourplex. Allowed use, allowed form is an interesting one. So within the MX3 zone, which is that Fairview State, this activity centers where we want and feel density is helpful. So we want taller buildings. We want the density there. That's the point of it. If you're in an MX3 and you're building like that, you're building a tall building that has mixed use and is up on the street and designed for transit and all those kinds of things, you're allowed use, allowed form, which means that you can go ahead and build. There's no public hearing. If you're in that zone, however, and you're not doing that, so you're in an MX3 place we want density, feel it's helpful, and you're building a 1-story building with a bunch of surface parking around it, then you're allowed use alternative form, which does require a public hearing. So then, allowed use alternative form, you're actually going to the Planning and Zoning Commission to explain why this particular case on these few streets where we really want density, you don't think it's possible. So again, in furtherance of this idea that we want the ordinance to be working for us, you know, again, sit with it for a few days. So these are the 4, and then one other thing I'll mention here is that we're recreating something Boise used to have, which is a hearings examiner. So the hearing examiner is like a quasi-judicial type setting where we have an examiner, a hearing examiner, who's hearing certain kinds of cases. Like if you have a variance case, you know, the way it works now is you go to the Planning and Zoning Commission, that could get appealed to City Council and all those kinds of things. What we're instituting is the hearing examiner. Again, will hire someone that will hold a regular public meeting, you know, inform everybody of the hearing, hear testimony, all those kinds of things, and then make a decision based on the code regarding things like variances. But importantly, the hearing examiner will also hear appeals of the type 2s. So if you have a type 2 case that doesn't go to public hearing, and then you've got someone that doesn't agree and wants to appeal that, then they would appeal to the hearing examiner. Hearing examiner would hear it, hear all the testimony, make a decision, and that's the final decision. So that it's over with then. So right now, of course, appeals can go to both the Planning and Zoning Commission. Well, actually, technically, they can go from Design Review Commission to Planning Commission to City Council. In this circumstance, we'll have a hearing examiner that will hear that, and then that will be the end of the appeal. So there's a lot to this. The things that go to Planning and Zoning Commission and then City Council are things that, like a conditional use permit, or if you're rezoning a property. So if you're coming into the city and you don't want the MX3 that you have, you want MX4 or something else, then you know, that's a rezoning, so you do have to go through Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council. Because if you're making an amendment to the zoning ordinance, you still have to follow the public process, of course. Or if we're annexing someone, that's something that goes to Planning and Zoning and then City Council for final decision. So the Planning Commission and City Council will still hear, you know, amendments to the zoning ordinance, annexations, things like this. So that's that. Any questions about that? Yes.
I have questions about something else. So,
Let's
related
come
to this.
back to it. Let me finish and see if I answer anything with the remainder of these. Sit with this as well. So this is kind of the process here. There's a number of things that we're doing to try to make it a consistent, predictable process. But with regard to any of the 4 types, you can see up in the upper left, this is showing you where you start the process on this sheet here. So I start the process there, and what do I do? In these orange kind of icons here are places in the process where you're kind of, which we have today, but this is trying to clearly articulate what the process is. We have these kinds of things today, it's just that you don't know when they're coming. So this is basically just to show you what does this process actually look like. So it's early assistance for us to determine, okay, what of the 4 types is this? Okay, now we can get started. We have something called a concept review here with our staff to go over what are you proposing to do on the site? You know, what will you do? Then if you're a type 1 or type 2A, you know, after you go through concept review and then you design your project for submittal, then you're done. You know, there's an off ramp here at the top. If you're a type 1 or a type 2A, then you're done with the process on that first line. Now, the difference between a type 2A and a type 2B has to do with whether or not you need an interdepartmental review meeting. So this meeting involves all of our city staff, not just planning, but also ACHD, outside agencies, outside the city that need to be involved in approval. So this is a bigger project, a type 2B, like one of those allowed forums I was talking about, like on Fairview. Big redevelopment of a commercial site, you know, huge surface parking lot, little commercial building, they're turning it into apartment buildings and mixed use. That's pretty complex. It's approved. It doesn't have to go to public hearing, but it does need everybody to weigh in, all the different agencies. So a type 2B would be those bigger type 2s that do need a thorough review by all the different agencies. But if you're a type 1 or type 2A, you're done up here. So you're doing a triplex on a R1 lot or something, you're doing an ADU, you're done right there. So now there are neighborhood meetings. If you are going to proceed, you're not a type 1 or type 2A, then you will have a neighborhood meeting for those things that are going to go to hearing. These are the hearings down here that you're potentially headed to if you're a type. If you're type 3 or 4, you do have to have a hearing. So in those cases where you're headed to a hearing, you have to go to the neighborhood, of course, present what you're proposing, and then you don't come to our committee until after you go to the neighborhood, so you get the neighborhood's feedback before you come to the interdepartmental review. And then once you do that, now you're submitting your application, and then on to your board or commission. One thing I'll mention here, we got to change this graphic a little bit, but if you're a type 2B, again, doesn't require any of these public hearings, you don't actually do this. You go from design further, so you did your concept review meeting, now you're designing it further so you can already, and then you jump up. We need to use like Candyland or something where you've got the little sheets and things, because you go from here to there. We may do that actually. It's not a bad graphic. But again, the point is the type 2s don't go to hearing. They don't go to any of these hearings. So it's all just administrative review. So that is the other graph. This is the other handout I have here for you to take with you and sit with as well. Next slide. Let's see. Okay, a couple other things that are coming up, and this is in preparation for implementation on December 1st. We're gonna have a development tracker, a new, right now, if you wanna really keep up with what development's happening in your neighborhood, for instance, you have to navigate a CELA, which is not easy to do. It's a very technical program, not really meant to be user-friendly for somebody in the community, or you have to call people and things like this, So the development tracker will be an online program where you can go in and actually sign up to receive emails about new development in your part of the city. So you can see, you can sign up to be in a different area and get emails about development that's being submitted. So you have visibility on what of these, 4 types are coming into the city at all times. So it'll give people a lot more visibility on what's actually happening in the city, which we're really excited about. Next slide. And then a couple other things we're working, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. This one has to do with, the new code goes into effect on December 1st. So we're gonna, in November, be transitioning, so we're having meetings with people right now, of course, about things they're wanting to build. There'll be a point at which we're transitioning to the new code. So, essentially November 30th, we'll transition to the new code, but there's going to be a couple of months, even into 2024, where like planning and zoning, we will be, and then planning and zoning and city council will still be working through, old code applications, because it takes a little while. So it may even be beyond February, but we're hoping we know how many we've kind of got coming in and how many discussions we've had, like pre-applications we've had for new development. So we're anticipating that if things progress the way they can, that we would work through those things in February, and then in March, our commissions and so forth would start working on new code cases. So Design Review Commission would start getting new code cases, or P&Z would start seeing new cases under the new code. So that's kind of where we're going to be. We're going to transition from the old code to the new code. That is December 1st, but after December 1st, we'll still be approving things in the old code, and the commissions, you'll be seeing cases, at these public bodies that are old code cases. And we think that'll be done by February. It may go a little further, and that's fine. But that's kind of how the transition is going to happen. And then a couple other things. So we're redoing the website for planning, which is a very dated website. If you've looked at it, not terribly helpful. So in preparation for December 1st, to a question earlier, we will be launching a new website that's going to be very much easier to use and follow all of the new processes, of course. And whether you're someone that's submitting a project, because it'll have a project page, so I'm an applicant, I'm submitting something to kind of help you through the process, or if you're somebody that just wants to know what's going on, it's going to be a lot easier to navigate. So that will be launched in preparation for December 1st. And then Acela, there's a lot of work going on in the background to shift the Acela systems to operate under the new code. If you've used Acela, it's a very specific, program used by many cities on permitting, and we're doing all those things you do, whatever they are, to make sure that the Acela system will operate under the new code on December 1st. Next slide. And that is it. So that's the new zoning ordinance. And again, we've been living with this one that we have for quite a while, and there'll be some bumps in the road. I think Cameron too, as we're working through all these things, some kind of update from us, middle of November, it could end up just being some kind of communication we put out to the realtors, or it could be we come back out again just to remind everybody, and as we're about to turn on the lights of the new ordinance, what's about to happen, showcase the new website that'll be available, maybe work people through that website as to how it works. We can be in communication as to what you think is the most helpful way to do it. But we would want to have some more communication with you again in about 60 days as we're preparing for December 1st. So that is the end of the presentation. Happy to take other questions. Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna just give you 3 questions, completely unrelated. First of all, when you were talking about the design process and when the applicant submits the application after they've gone through the neighborhood review, what's the time frame to expect a result on that? We've got something going in the Whitewater Park area, I'm just curious.
From the neighborhood meeting to
The neighborhood meetings held and then your hearing, then you go to the hearing process to get approved so you can start building. What's that time frame looking like?
yes, there you go, right there. So you have your neighborhood meeting, and the question is kind of how long can you expect to get there? Yeah, I mean,
Now, how long can you expect to get from there to the end to start building? Are you talking 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks?
from here to start building?
From after you've had your neighbor review and you've set in your application, now this whole bottom line, is that 4 weeks, 6 weeks?
Yeah, so the bottom line is really from when you submit to when you have a hearing. And so it very much depends on when you submit. So it could be 30 days, it could be 60 days, depending on, when you submit. This part of the process, I have to say, from neighborhood meeting, if you're going to a hearing and you've been to your neighborhood and then you're going to go through interdepartmental review, application, into a hearing, the time associated with that has so much to do with the size and complexity of it. Because if it's relatively simple, then it's going to be, pretty quick. If it's a big project, many acres.
What's pretty quick mean to you?
Well, I mean, 60 days.
Okay.
So, but if the thing, and I was meeting with someone recently about this, which is why it's on my mind, I said, because they were on, what's the dates, and we can give you dates for hearings. The question mark is, how long are you going to spend here? Because sometimes if it's a really big project, you're going to want to be at the neighborhood more than once. I mean, because you don't want this to go poorly.
Right.
So the quality of this has a lot to do with, what happens here. So it could be that you're in the neighborhood kind of review for a few months. Some even longer. Anyway,
That's perfect, thank you. And then the second question is, on the ADUs, there's been some talk about maybe expanding the square footage on those.
yes.
And so is that gonna get expanded and to what size?
This question is about ADUs and the potential to enlarge the square footage of them. We did do that in this new ordinance. In the new ordinance, it's 750 feet, square feet.
900.
Oh, it's 900. What is it today?
700.
So it's 700 today, and the new ordinance is 900 square feet. Another change that was made to the accessory dwelling unit is that it doesn't require off-street parking.
No, it does not.
So that was another change to try to make them simpler to do.
We've also relinquished the requirement
Oh,
to be,
yes,
for one of the units to be owner occupied, so both can be rented out and the owner does not have to be on premise.
Yes, Andrea, for those online, just to make sure everybody heard this, so the big changes to ADU are 900 square feet versus 700, no off-street parking. And then in the current code, there's a requirement that the owner live on the property. That requirement no longer exists under the new code.
What did you say about parking?
No.
That there's no parking required for the ADU in the new ordinance.
Thank you.
I'm going to jump in here because we got a couple questions online. First question is specifically from, I think, the entire zoning code document. It says page 208 under lot characteristics of the new code says projects with 3 to 4 dwelling units shall have no affordability requirements. Is this accurate?
Cameron, can you read that one more time?
Yeah, it says on page 208, under quote, lot characteristics of the new code, it says that projects with 3 to 4 dwelling units shall have no affordability requirements. It's a very specific question out of the entire zoning code.
Yeah, well, I know that, page 280 of the ordinance.
It's 208.
Sorry, 208. That changes my answer. But the new ordinance, and Andrea may be looking it up, but the 208, but The new ordinance requires that if you're in the R1 and you do more than the 2 units, then the additional 3 or 4, the additional 1 or 2, that is, have to meet the affordability requirements, period. So that's what the new ordinance says. If that statement was in the R1 provisions for more than 2 units, then that would be incorrect. So Andrea's looking it up, I think, so we can get to the bottom of that.
Okay, I've got another question. What is the time necessary to get from applicant contacts PDS to approve if there is no appeal?
Well, again, that would have everything to do with the type it is. So type 2, for instance, under no appeal could be as quick as 30 days, or it could be as long as 90 days, depending on the size and complexity of it. The reason I say the 90 days is, you know, again, if you're a big site, commercial, mixed use, and you're gonna end up at interdepartmental review, I'm imagining there's gonna be some back and forth with the applicant in cases like that regarding the design of it. And Cameron, on that question again, what was the end of the question,
The second question?
Yeah, the second question.
It says, I'll just read it short. What is the time necessary to get from, quote, applicant contacts PDS to, quote, approve if there is no appeal?
Right. Yeah. Well, the big thing about the appeal, I'll add to what I said before, is that with regard to any appeals, the difference between the new code and the old code is the hearing examiner. So, you know, the hearing examiner will be meeting once a month, and among the things that they will hear are appeals in cases of those type 2s that don't require a hearing. So imagine, you know, under the existing code, you're required, if you're a big project, which is probably what we're talking about, a larger scale thing, you likely have a design review commission meeting, a planning and zoning commission meeting, and a planning and zoning commission meeting, period. If however, there's an appeal associated with those cases, you could end up with 1 or 2, then under appeal, 3 additional meetings, because those appeals can go to the design review commission, it would go back to the design review commission, the planning and zoning commission, and then potentially city council if the appellant, you know, keeps going all the way through those commissions, which often happens. That's not unusual. So there's a level of uncertainty associated with that in terms of timing. There's certainly a lot longer period of time that you're in that appeals process. So among the reasons for recreating the hearing examiner was to have 1 meeting, hear the facts, render a decision on that appeal, and be done. It's finished. And that hearing examiner will be holding those hearings once a month. So obviously there's much more certainty there as to what's going to happen, and in addition, it's going to be a much faster process. Yes.
The ADUs, specifically construction requirements with regards to being on foundations, I think I had heard that that was a requirement, like someone couldn't bring a mini house in on a trailer and set it up. Is that, what are the requirements? Is it like a crawl space foundation or a slab foundation or a pier and post with skirting? What if they brought in?
Well, an accessory dwelling unit is not a, you know, I guess what some call a tiny house, a mobile tiny house, which you bring, you know, that's built somewhere else and you bring to your site and you install it somehow, whether it's with skirting or even a regular foundation. An accessory dwelling unit is a stick-built, I mean, it could be modular construction, but it's following the building code, you know, an accessory dwelling unit. It's not following some other alternative code like what you're describing in the case of a mobile tiny house.
Question right here in the back. You have a question?
No, I was just gonna say, so you're saying it has to be on a foundation then, essentially?
Yes.
Okay, I've got 2 more questions. that are still tied to page 208. So I'm not sure what's going on page 208, but I'm just going to kind of combine these. It says planning and zoning states that MLDs will require deed restrictions for quote bonus lots, but the new code states on page 208 that it won't apply for 3 to 4 units. Could you clarify that?
I might need you to read that again.
Planning and zoning states that MLDs will require deed restrictions for quote bonus lots, but the new code states on page 208 that it won't apply for 3 to 4 units. Could you clarify that?
And MLDs?
A minor land division.
Oh, okay, minor land division,
We're
okay.
making it a little bit harder than it has to be, so, yes.
Yeah.
So when we talked about the first question, it does say.
Andrew, you might want to come up.
All
Just because there's some online that wouldn't hear you.
I'm assuming this is Mr. Dave Kangas.
It says anonymous attendee.
Hello, yes, so on page 208, when we talk about incentive, when we look at our incentives, we actually have 6 different incentives. Page 208 is referring to incentive number 2. And ultimately, that says that we allow for strategic infill to be located in places if it has the right location, the right site characteristics, and other criteria that's met. And so with that, yes, 3 to 4 units does not require any affordability. So that statement is correct. When we're talking about, are you utilizing an incentive, we have said, yes, you can subdivide that because we want to make owner occupancy a priority. We believe that all citizens should have a home. So if we can make that happen, it shouldn't matter if it's owner occupied or if it's rental occupied. So we have made that allowance to do that. It's not through the minor land division, it's through a traditional subdivision process, but it does allow you to get there.
Thank you, Andrew. This triggered, I understand now. Can you go back to the slide that shows those incentives, just to clarify why this uncertainty is here? Yeah, keep going. One more, maybe? One more. And I mentioned this when I was going through these. Oh, I'm sorry. This is okay. So I mentioned a couple of incentives. One is that if you're in an R1 lot, you can do 3 or 4 units, provided the additional units are affordable, and that applies to any R1 lot, anywhere in the neighborhood. So that was the first one I mentioned. The second one I mentioned, which this is referring to, this 208. Page 208 is referring to is strategic infill, which actually says that if you meet those criteria, so you're on that collector or within 300 feet, and you're a vacant lot, or you reuse the house, under those criteria, you can do up to 4 units with no affordability. You can do 5 to 8 if one of them is, and 9 to 12 if 2 of them are. So that's the distinction between the two. So the 208 is referring to the strategic infill, which, true, up to 4 units does not require the affordability, but you have to meet those in the case of the strategic infill, have to be on the collector, have to reuse the house or be a vacant lot. So there's some additional restrictions on you as to when you can do it. So I hope that clears that up.
I think it does, and we're right at 10 o'clock, so we're gonna wrap up here, but I just wanna let everybody know in the building and online that our next 59-minute meeting will be in December. It'll be a reporter's forum, so look for information on that. If you have any additional questions, just go ahead and email me, Cameron@boirealtors.com, and we can get those over to the City of Boise. But I wanna thank Tim and Andrea for coming in and getting us educated on the Boise zoning code rewrite. And if you need the recording, just let me know. That should be available later today. Thank you.